Well, I want to welcome Anna. We have several people online. We have Julie Frederick. Would you just say hi, Julie, so that she hears your voice?
Hi, Anna. Hi there.
And we have Laura Schwartz.
Yeah, we did.
Hi, welcome.
Thank you.
And we have Laurel Ostro.
Hi, Anna.
Hi, Laurel.
And we have Patricia Young.
Hi, Tricia.
Hi again.
We've met. Hi. And who's in the room? Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Julie, Heaven Street.
Oh, hi, Julie.
Julie and Norma are here. I think
Okay.
she spent some time with both.
Good.
But
Well, I want to welcome all of you to our presentation today by our visiting faculty, Anna Richardson, which many of you have already met. She's from the Department of Nursing at the Institute of Canterbury in New Zealand. Anna arrived on our campus last week from Christchurch, New Zealand, and she has spent time with several faculty already. She's on the Faculty of Health, Humanities and Science of the Polytechnic Institute of Technology, and you can guess that she's here because she has such a strong interest in family nursing. And she's with us today because of her interest also related to cultural safety and primary health nursing. Anna is the Bachelor of Nursing program leader in her institution, and her aims are to support a revision of their Bachelor of Science or their Bachelor of Nursing degree program. And so she is here in terms of gathering more ideas and more energy around that idea. Today her presentation focuses on health in New Zealand and key concepts of cultural safety, and she's hoping that we'll be able to relate that presentation to health and working with minorities here in the United States. So I know that she wants to welcome all of you, and she hopes to engage you in some discussion on this important topic. So Anna, I'll just turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you very much. This PowerPoint is enormous, and I found I was presenting it in Saskatchewan, as you can see, the Saskatchewan written on there. So if you're patient with me, I will be going through and not discussing some of the slides, but I'm very happy to leave the whole document with people because it's on flash drive. Anyway, let's just get started because it's quite a long conversation about cultural safety and cultural competence now. Oh yes, oh there I am, just an introduction. It's a little bit blonder in those days, in that photo. And as you can see, I have quite a few various interests, and my passion really lies in primary health care and health promotion. And I really think family nursing, Māori health, primary health care, disaster education, they all go in together really, that they all inform each other. So just to begin with, we're defining family, and as we all know, Wright and Leahy say family is who they say they are. And it's really interesting to think about how New Zealand Māori, who are our Indigenous people, define family or whānau, because they have two key ideas about whānau, and the first one is whakapapa whānau, which is about links to family through genealogy and a common ancestor, and kaupapa whānau, which is about having a common purpose. So when I'm asking students about family, I ask them who's their kaupapa family or whānau, and it's quite often their colleagues. You know, they become a strong kaupapa family or whānau. I was going to say something about, we were talking about this morning. Norma invited me into a class where students were analysing their interview skills, and I was just saying to them is, in terms of cultural safety, we ask students to share a little bit about themselves if they're working with Māori families. So they might think that they might be crossing professional boundaries a little bit, but we ask them to say who they are, where they come from, and you know who their family might be, because Māori like that. That warms them. They find it, their ancestors are incredibly important to their culture, and they do align themselves with mountains and rivers and seas, probably like the indigenous people of America. And you know, so that's the thinking is, we don't expect students to make something up and say, you know, I align myself to this river, but to share a little bit about themselves. So you might want to think about who is your kaupapa whānau, and I bet you it is probably your colleagues, because if you're anything like me, I really value my colleagues and really enjoy working with them. They're part of my life as well as my family. So while we're on the subject, this is my oldest son who is learning about doing a bachelor's degree in Japanese, and he's heading over to Japan next year to Hiroshima for a scholarship, and he's going to be studying at the university for about 4 months of his final year in his degree. This is another family member, Eva, who's our Burmese, Silver Point Burmese cat. She's getting a rough up from my younger son. That's my younger son in earlier days. He's a lot hairier now. He's got long hair. And this is where we live.
Beautiful.
In the settlement in front of the peninsula is Sumner, and we live up on the hill on the very right-hand side.
So are you moving into summer now? Is that what?
Yeah, we're in spring.
In spring. Oh.
So this is something that's defining us a little bit, and that is that we had some major earthquakes in Christchurch that began in 2010. You can see our cathedral is in a state of disrepair. There's a major argument going on in New Zealand, in Christchurch and wider, about whether we should rebuild our cathedral or tear it down and start again. And we've got nowhere in 5 years. The photo on the top right-hand corner is my family, and you can see they're trying to put a brave face on the fact that that was the day after a great big aftershock that 185 people died in, and the rock behind us, behind them, was disintegrated in the earthquake. And we're trying to be happy. We had no water, no power, our house was really destroyed inside, but we were trying to put a happy face on it. And that's an example of liquefaction, which happened right around the city, where the earth has been shaken so much that the water table rises. So that's a little bit of an introduction to my family, but we're to get on and talk about cultural safety and cultural competence. But I guess I've started the presentation in the Māori way, and just letting you know a little bit about me and the family. And we're going to talk about Māori health, and I'm hoping that it might relate to, if it's not about ethnicity, it might relate about, you might be able to relate to difference in your society. So where did cultural safety come from? I'm interested that you are engaged with transcultural nursing theory. We go with cultural safety and cultural competence in New Zealand. Kawa whakaruruho is the Māori word for cultural safety, and as you see on the slide, it began in a hui held in 1989, which was about the recruitment and retention issues around Māori nurses. And a student nurse, oh thank you, I'm getting water, Hinarani Moore, coined the phrase of cultural safety by saying, you people talk about legal safety, ethical safety, safety in clinical practice, and a safe nursing knowledge base, but what about cultural safety? Sadly, Hinerangi didn't experience any sort of glory or feedback about her vision because she died as a young woman with a brain tumour, leaving behind a little girl, which is really sad. Seems to happen to our Indigenous people too. So why does cultural care matter? And I'm not going to expect people to come up with some ideas because of the time factor, but I've had a lot of feedback from the Saskatchewan master's students and the bachelor students, and they came up with some different ideas, but they talked about diversity in general, which is great. But, you know, we all are facing an ageing population, that the nuclear family is declining. There are a lot of people living on their own in this day and age. And, you know, that we have people that have different impairments who are living in our community. So we do face a lot of diversity, and culturally safe approach might be one solution or one approach that is useful with families. So who are Māori, you might ask? You can see on that slide that up until 1974, Māori were defined as having 50% or more Māori blood. And I was really interested in Canada that the First Nations people are still defined by their ancestry to obtain scholarships and funding for education, whereas our Māori, they just need to identify as Māori. And I think that that solves a lot of problems. It seems to help to reduce some distress for Māori that are seeking opportunities. We're really interested to see what people have to say about that. So why is Māori health or Indigenous health important? And I think that this goes everywhere, right around the world. As you can see, those determinants of health. So I won't go on about those. You might be able to read those. I'll just give you a moment. But as you can see, cultural safety was developed initially to address these disparities and inequities in health status. And I think we've achieved some advances for Māori health, and Māori have achieved those as well. So, you know, there is an improvement. So, and there are some more statistics that, and I'll just give you an example. That it says there, infants are 5 times more likely to die of sudden unexpected death in an infant. And there have been some great advances. I remember in the 1990s, it was Māori babies that were dying of sudi the most. They were really figuring high in the statistics, and the World Child Services that we have in New Zealand are for registered nurses 0 to 5 care. So they pick up the referral of the new or expanded family 6 weeks after the birth of that infant. So the midwife hands over the care of the family, and they've decided that, well, they were and probably still are to some extent a very white middle class group of registered nurses, and have developed a bicultural service where there are Māori nurses caring for Māori with Māori processes. So they've helped to advance breastfeeding, baby positioning, not bed sharing, taking cigarettes outside or smoking cessation, and all of those research-based ideas that can help promote safety for infants. This is Sir Mason Jury, who is a leading public health specialist that happens to be Māori. He's published, and he's asked us to stop seeing Māori health with a deficit model. And I think that that really is in keeping with family nursing, and that is that we approach family nursing with a strengths and capability focus, and Māori have made huge gains for their health. For example, you can see their life expectancy has really improved. Still a way to go. I think it's incredibly inequitable that many Māori do not experience the joy of retirement. They die before that, and I think that's a bit of a scandal, and that's something to keep us going with in terms of nursing. If that doesn't give a little bit of passion to your workload, I can't think what wouldn't be. So, you know, how has that happened? I think I've talked a little bit about it, is that really basically the increase in the Māori health workforce, and we think that the ideal is Māori health services by Māori for Māori. And there's a major tribe in the South Island, the Ngāi Tahu, and they are incredible business people. They're making a lot of money with their businesses, and they are pouring money back into Māori communities. So it's a positive story, but not a story that we can sit back on our couches and think, right, that it's all done and dusted. So Jury says we need to shift the emphasis to wellness, not sickness. This is all based on our treaty. We signed, the British bet the French to colonising New Zealand, and we signed a treaty between the colonisers, the British and the Māori, in 1840. And then the colonisers set about not abiding by that treaty for many years, and we've had long ongoing treaty education that's going into primary schools, high schools, and our Department of Nursing. That's one of the first things that students engage with, is Indigenous health and treaty education before they get started into the bachelor's degree. So we work with those principles that have been derived from the treaty in 1988 of partnership, participation and protection. And I think that that's a great model for nursing practice, and it's a great model for family nursing. Firstly, tina rangatiratanga, which is self-determination, and as you can see, the definition is what I've really been talking about, is the empowerment of Māori, their autonomy over their health care, that Māori health for Māori by Māori, and meaningful partnerships for Māori health, participation with Māori and their whānau in health care and decision making and planning of interventions, and protection of Māori culture. So, you know, being prepared. I think I've got some examples coming up where nurses need to put their necks out a little bit and be prepared to try something that's a little bit different and a bit new, so that Māori can have their cultural needs met in their healthcare. So who was the architect of cultural safety? It was Dr. Irihāpiti Ramsden, who was our cultural safety advisor in our department for many years up until her death in 2003. Irihāpiti was a consumer of healthcare because she had chronic asthma and had severe asthmatic attacks, and she died of breast cancer, sad to say, at a very young age of 57. And she went from the inspiration of Hinarangi Moa to coining the phrase of cultural safety, that it's the effective nursing practice of a person or family from another culture and is determined by that person or family. So that's a really key concept of cultural safety, which we're going to go into. So concept one is, and this is a bit tricky, the client and family retain the power to define the feeling of cultural safety. That is tricky because we are all expected, our undergraduate students, registered nurses, to demonstrate that our practice is culturally safe. And as you can imagine, it's not culturally safe to pressure a family, for example, to find out whether we have been culturally safe or not. And families may not tell you, but they might tell you with their actions if they felt unsafe, and that is that they may not turn up to an appointment and they might disengage with the healthcare services. And that's what actually seems to happen is some whānau we have to chase, and there is a sense of mistrust with health services as some of the experiences that the families might have had is passed down from generation to generation. Some of the stories of hurt are passed on, so we have to try and address that. Concept 2 is considering what culture is and the categories of difference. So, you know, what is culture? You know, for you, your families, and for you, you know, what would you count as the cultures in America, for example? Nursing Council defines culture as categories of difference, and I think I've left off age there. So let's add age. It's culture includes but is not restricted to gender, sexual orientation, occupational and socio-economic status, ethnic origin, migrant experience, religious or spiritual belief, and disability. So age I would add there. And the other one that I would like Nursing Council to consider, this little upstart from the South Island, is body size, because I see, sadly, registered nurses discriminating people and judging people because they are perceived as being too thin or too fat or whatever. And, you know, so I think that that's a growing category of difference for people that, you know, for their experiences. So as you can see, this is just one of our competencies, and the competency that covers cultural safety is 1.5, practices nursing in a manner that the client determines as being culturally safe. Last night online on my phone, I just updated my practicing certificate, and I was pledging hand on heart that I am staying culturally safe, and my argument would be that I am in terms of this is a topic that I teach, and now I can say I've presented it in Canada and in the United States, so there you go. So yeah, Nursing Council, take that. This is what some examples of our culture, and I find it really interesting because I'm non-Māori, and yet I had identified some images that are Māori. And it's funny because when non-Māori New Zealanders are asked, you know, what is your culture? It's probably, you might come up with this too, is you might think to yourself, well, what is our culture? You know, what are those defining features? And we got a bit stuck, and Māori found it really humorous that we would look towards them in terms of defining our culture. But I also chose a very traditional, old-fashioned 1950s family nursing scene there, with a nurse in there, our iconic kiwi, a little bit of our country on the world map, because we really are in the corner pocket of the world, and rugby, you know, because they are all features of our culture. And Queenstown is the top right-hand corner. That's at the top of the gondola, and it's an area of many lakes. It's a very beautiful place. People go there to ski in winter, which is June, July and August, and in summer take on those freezing lakes. They might swim and boat in them. It's very picturesque. Concept 3 is to be regardful of difference. So it's very different to Florence Nightingale's days of being regardless of difference. And you still hear nurses today saying, well, everybody's the same. I like to nurse people the same. Well, we say that's completely backwards and everybody's different. So it's really important to recognise that difference. Another key concept, I am scooting along here, is about power, because cultural safety is informed by critical social theory and being aware of social justice and the significance of nurses' power, prejudice and attitudes. So we really encourage our undergraduates and all registered nurses to reflect on their practice and reflect on their attitudes and their power. So that Hills wrote about we're using power with clients and family rather than power over. And I think that Hills also wrote about the principles of health promotion, which I think are very in line with cultural safety. The primacy of people, you know, that people are the centre of health promotion, enabling and empowerment. And I often talk to students about when they realise that they have power, you know, their power grows from day one in the nursing degree because they are taking on knowledge, skills, and they have knowledge of how to access resources and facilitate referrals. So that's how I explain to students how they can share their power, is by sharing that knowledge and skills and making useful referrals to other agencies for families, for example. So Nursing Council says the nurse who can understand his or her own culture and the theory of power relationships can be culturally safe in any context. So I think that's very reassuring for our undergraduates, is that because I think they do want to be culturally safe in their practice, and if they are, it kind of helps them to be able to work with any family. So concept 4, and I found it really interesting this morning because Norma was talking about self-reflection and critical analysis and how we shouldn't go overboard, you know, where it could be negative and paralyse the nurse. Because I listen to that because I'm one of those people that can over-reflect. I'm just going to take a sip of water. Weeper is a well worthwhile author about cultural safety, and she writes about how important it is for us to reflect and critically analyse our own beliefs, attitudes and values. And I see it in terms, well, Eda Hapati probably saw it in terms of baggage, that we need to think about what presses our buttons when we're working with individuals and families, and ensure that we don't tip those attitudes and beliefs and judgments onto families that we own. So to understand that we're a bearer of his or our or her own culture, history, attitudes and life experiences. In terms of ethnicity, that's probably, we are the bearer of racist views, judgmental views, viewing Māori in stereotypical ways, and that's why we undertake treaty education with Māori lecturers to try and unearth those handed-on attitudes and beliefs that our students might have heard from their families, for example. So, for example, we have nursing students that arrive in our degree where the families are saying, oh, you don't need to care about that cultural nonsense. You know, that's just a pile of garbage. So they need to throw off that kind of baggage to move on to become registered nurses and be professional with families. Another term that we need to think about is we're not normal, in inverted commas. And so our undergraduates, for instance, and registered nurses might think that we're the norm and that we are the mainstream. In actual fact, our clients and families see us as exotic and probably pretty scary, and particularly in the hospital setting where we have a way of dressing, we behave differently. You know, I ask the students, since you've started nursing, do you wash your hands differently? Do you make beds differently? You know, they're just small examples of how exotic we are. And I think it's really great in terms of self-reflection is to think about how exotic we are. So self-awareness, I think I've covered about self-reflection and thinking about our baggage in interviews. So that came up this morning. It was really interesting. Not that the students were loading their baggage onto their interviewees, but some of the students were reflecting and saying, oh, I've got something in common with the people that I was interviewing, and they were dealing with some of the feelings that were coming up when they were in the interview. And I think there's none of us that haven't experienced that. So it's really important to be aware of that so that we don't dump it onto families. So Ramsden has challenged us, so this is the challenge beyond the grave. We need to be aware of past injustices and social discrimination in our society and then do something about it. So she wants us to be very political, and I often talk to students about that, you know, what can you do? And in our country, one of the things that they can do is if they're working in primary health care, is they can get to know their local Minister of Parliament, their local MP, tell them, you know, what they're seeing in the community, what's going on, who's disadvantaged, where are the inequities, you know, what could they do to help support the health of the community. It's quite simple, really, but, you know, we need to get onto that. We also teach cultural competence, and I personally think that this has come from our medical colleagues, because nursing, cultural safety has actually always been associated with nursing. We rode the rough road of launching it as a theory, and we got a lot of backlash. And our docs say, oh, cultural safety is not for us. So they're Māori medical lecturers are teaching cultural competence, and we are too nowadays. So you can see it's defined as the capability of nurse to articulate and demonstrate culturally appropriate and acceptable health services where the clients feel culturally safe, and reflecting the nurse's reflexivity, knowledge and skills and ability to work meaningfully with clients to meet their unique health and cultural needs during their health experience. So it's about having the attitudes, the skills and knowledge needed to achieve this. So how do we go about that is through this process of reflection, communication, using fundamental values, empathy, motivation, being quality driven and leadership. So I'll give you some examples. I'm not the Richardson in that part of that. I'd love to claim that reference. There's quite a few Richardsons in cultural safety these days. Fran Richardson and I'm just trying to think, Sandra Richardson, who's a colleague that I work with, and now me just a tiny bit with one publication. So What are the differences between cultural safety and cultural competence? Cultural safety is about the client feeling comfortable or safe with healthcare, and you can see cultural competence is about the ability of health practitioners to demonstrate what is needed to achieve that. So that's trying to get away from that first concept, or try to get around it, where the family or the receiver of the care is the person that identifies whether they are culturally safe or not. So this is one process that we teach nursing students in terms of communicating in a culturally competent way. When Māori meet in a hui, which is a gathering, they go through a process, and a lot of the things that Māori do are process driven, which I personally love. I think that they do things very well. It's a very sort of holistic approach. So they will embark with a mihi mihi, which is a greeting and engagement. So that's why we ask students to share a little bit about themselves. A formal mihi mihi would be something like this, you know, in Māori, where you would say, you know, kia ora, which is good health. I'm Anna Richardson. I was born in Kaitaia. My family live in Auckland. My family's in Christchurch. I have an association with this mountain. It might be Mount Aoraki, and this is the river that, you know, my family is associated with, or this is the sea. And they're basically just telling you about themselves, and that's why we want students to greet patients, clients, families, whānau, and say, you know, hello, I'm Anna Richardson. I've been assigned to be your nurse today. You know, this is, and talk about to make a connection, which is called whakawhānangatanga. And that might involve sharing a little bit about myself. It might be the person might want to ask, you know, well, do you have family? You know, so I might be in a maternity ward. Who are your whānau? So I might say, well, I've actually got 2 sons, and it was a long time ago since I had babies. And, you know, just to talk a little bit about and making that connection. And then the kaupapa is the main purpose of the meeting. So, you know, it could be that today I want to run you through your management of your diabetes. I understand that you've only just heard that you've got type 2 diabetes, and there might be some talk that you're going to be going on metformin medication. I just wanted to talk to you a bit about how to manage that. And then nothing is done without a conclusion, and that's called a pora aki, which means a farewell. And that's done very formally when it's a hui, and people, there's a lot of speeches, but you just don't walk away, go off shift, and not conclude your interaction for the future. So I'm going to do the skipping that I said that I was going to do because I want to look, this is just skipping through some research that I did with public health nurses. If you're interested in that, I've just had the article accepted by Nursing Inquiry, and it'll be coming up. I don't know when it's going to be published. It's just going through processes, but it will be published, called Expressions of Cultural Safety in Public Health Nursing. We use several Māori health models in our teaching, and I just thought I'd show you a simple one that Mason Jury developed called Te Whare Tapawhā, and it's based on the model of a whare, which is a house. And it makes sense, I think, to a lot of people. I think he's regretted developing this because non-Māori have picked it up and run with it. And so we've developed we've listened to Māori and taken on other models of health as well. So the whare or house, like a real house, has 4 sides, and as you can imagine, if one of those sides is weakened, it affects the other aspects of the house. So it's Te Taha Whānau, which is family health, Te Taha Tinana, which is physical health, Te Taha Hinenaro, which is mental health, and Te Taha Wairua, which is spiritual health. And I don't know what you would think, which would be the most important dimension to Māori health, do you think? And it's probably the same for Indigenous Americans. Spiritual, absolutely. So it's incredibly important. So we get students to utilise that model in their practice. We also use the Meihana model, and that's taught in Year 2 before students go out into practice in mental health. I'm just going to skip through it, but just to show you how holistic it is. You know, so of course the identification of self-identification as Māori is important, so the patient is in that model. So, you know, as you can see, we have an indicator that is imperative, is that Māori define themselves. We don't define who's Māori and who isn't. In New Zealand, for example, you might be blonde-haired and blue-eyed, but you could identify as Māori. You don't necessarily have to have brown skin and dark hair. Whānau, incredibly important, and there you can see those concepts of biological and kaupapa whānau. Tinana, which is physical health and functioning of the person. Hinenaro, which is the psychological and emotional well-being of the person. Wairua, the beliefs regarding connectedness and spirituality. I'll just give you an example which might seem a little bit kind of random, is the word that we use in New Zealand. I was told about a young Māori man that was admitted to a mental health facility, and this was at a health hui, where the person became psychotic, and what transpired was they found that this young man was growing marijuana at Urupā, which is a grave site, and that's sacred or tapu and it's just not to be done. When that was discovered, when the marijuana was removed, that person became well. So there's an example that might be a bit hard to get your head around, but I think shows the importance of Wairua. And taio, which is the physical environment of the patient and the whānau. And Māori are very connected to the environment. One of the things that I studied when I was doing my Masters was the importance of the sea to Māori, and they're spiritually connected because there is a god of the sea, the Tangaroa. And also they are horrified about how the sea is treated in modern days. For example, Māori people would leach sewage on rocks in the sun, and the idea of treated sewage going out into the sea at high tide is fairly horrific to them. You know, so you can see the engagement with the environment. Iwi katoa, which is the services and systems that provide support for patients and whānau within their health environment. We have more and more health services that are outreach and go out to marae, which are meeting houses for Māori, and going into family homes. And you know, so as nurses, we're not expecting people to come to us, we're going to them. So this is an example of the Meihana model, so I might let you read that for a moment. I think it might have been jet lag, but in Canada I got upset reading this, and I think it's because it's about a young man, and you know, it's pretty sad, I think. And then I'll see if we can just finish with showing you what a haka is. I'll just give you a minute. Have you had time?
Mm-hmm.
So this is just, to me, is an example of cultural safety, and that is in that ward for those young rangatahi or young Māori to be able to say goodbye to manu. That might have created a bit of inconvenience. It might have created a bit of noise, and you'll see what I mean by noise in a minute. It might have meant shutting the doors of the ward for the other patients, but incredibly vital for those young people to be able to farewell him and start some sort of healing and grieving. So let's see if I can get that to go. May not. It didn't. Yeah.
You gonna get it?
Oh, look, there we go.
Oh, you got it?
That might do
Oh,
it.
there you go.
This is an example at a tangi or a funeral. So that might seem really strange to watch.
Go back to the, on the bottom there where you're talking.
Oh. No. Oh, yeah. Oh, dear. There? No, there, probably.
Oh.
Oh, started it again.
No.
Oh, well, that doesn't really matter because that can go on in the background. You might have seen haka when New Zealand are starting a rugby match, for example, but it's calling on ancestors, it's talking about the mana or significance of that person, and it can be incredibly powerful. And I actually think Māori do funerals or tangi very well, and that is that it's a process where people do not feel ashamed of crying and expressing their emotion, and they have an opportunity to really speak. So that's what it would have sounded like and looked a bit like in the ward for manu. So that was really all I wanted to talk about today. You can see that there are other models of health that we use, and I hope that was of some interest and you might be able to relate to it. Cultural safety is not only about ethnicity, so remember about those categories of difference and think about how cultural safety could be utilised for people with an impairment or gay, lesbian, transgender people, or, you know, anybody that's different to the provider of care, the health professional. So thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today about this topic, and it would have been lovely to hear your thoughts and had a bit more interaction, but time and the process was against us. So thank you.
Good. Wonderful.
Yeah. So very different to transcultural nursing, isn't it, really? Yeah. That's me.
Good. That was awesome.
Oh, was it? Oh, good.
Yeah.
Anna, maybe you want to
Yes.
see if there's any burning question that needs to be answered.
Any burning questions then?
So is there research then going on with cultural safety within the nursing group?
There, in our group, I think it's me at the moment, and that is when I've just completed some research with my colleague Judy Yarwood, and we were utilising the 15-minute interview right in Leahy's with public health nurses, and it was a collaborative, participative, educative project, and when we were going into the pre-education focus groups and post-education focus groups, I came out of them and I kept saying to Judy, I keep hearing cultural safety. It's just shouting at me. These public health nurses were coming up with just practical examples of how they were applying cultural safety practice. So thus, we conducted some secondary analysis on the data, and we wrote that article I was telling you about that's going to be published shortly in Nursing Inquiry called Expressions of Cultural Safety in Public Health Nursing, because I think we've got a dearth of literature that's actually about the application of cultural safety in practical ways in different nursing settings. So while I've been on academic study leave, I'm going to replicate that research that we did with public health nurses. So I've written a research proposal, and a group of us are going to investigate or apply the same 15-minute interview to our home visiting district nurses, who mostly work with older adults in the community with home visits. And they have a restorative health promoting focus. So I think we might get some different, or we will get some different data. So you never know what's going to come out of that one.
Thank you.
It's interesting how you've defined nursing and nurses as exotic and
Yes.
different. And we always talk about cultural safety as something like nursing is applying to other people. So I wonder if it could be turned around the opposite way. And some investigation could be done about the cultural safety for nursing.
Among nurses?
Yeah, because
with
you
each
would
other.
identify them as exotic. You would identify them as, there's some past injustices that have been done to nurses.
True.
And there's some social discrimination between nurses and your midwifery.
Absolutely. And I think we've said to students it's time that we moved out of being or thinking about ourselves as an oppressed group. But you're right, we have been, in society we have been oppressed. It's funny because when cultural safety was launched in New Zealand, we rode a rough ride with it because it hit the media, and the media mocked nurses for, and they called it cultural safety, and the media were running with stories describing what nurses should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing. And one of the things that we shouldn't be doing, according to them in the 1990s, was thinking about cultural safety and cultural care of individuals and families. It was a strong denial of the, that could possibly be important to nursing. So you're spot on, Norma. That's really interesting. I was also thinking about how we could be very culturally unsafe to each other. For example, horizontal violence, defining what is real nursing in inverted commas and what isn't. So I've experienced that a little bit being a public health nurse, because in the past, as public health nurses do, they don't wear a uniform, they don't have, they have highly honed skills, but they don't have the technical skills that a ICU nurse might have. And there has been comment among nurses that maybe they're not real nurses, because they're not doing those sort of things. So yeah, I don't think we can be that kind to each other as well. So maybe we need to take on those cultural safety messages with each other as well.
I think Laurel is maybe waiting to say something, and then Tricia.
Oh, well, I think at this point I just want to say that's just a fabulous comment about treating each other well and the whole cultural safety between nurses and between people in general. So I've enjoyed that. And I was going to comment also about how much, I've been muted mostly. I have 2 parakeets and they're really noisy, so I'm sorry if I'm disrupting. How much I appreciate the idea of sharing, of us sharing with our patients ourselves, and that's always such a fine, it has felt like a fine line, but I do think that patients appreciate that, and yet, we still have our boundaries, but teaching nursing students that is really brilliant, so I appreciated that. Anna, thank you.
It is a fine line, isn't it? Because, if you're dealing with somebody with mental illness, you may not really want to say, well, look, I've really been severely depressed too, and this is the medication that I was on. That's not necessarily going to be very helpful. But sometimes if, for instance, working with families, well, I often think having a family experience, whatever it is, and sharing that can be really helpful to families, even if it's to show that you're not judging them. So a common one, it could be, I don't know if your children do this, but in supermarkets, that can be the time when children will throw a wobbly, and they go through the sweet aisle,
Temper tantrum,
and
right?
they want sweet, yeah, and a temper tantrum, and it can be so affirming if, say if you were the nurse in that situation, if you just said, look, I've been there, I understand where you're coming from, and my children have done that too. It can be so affirming, so it's that kind of process that I was thinking of when you're working with families.
Absolutely.
Well, let's see. Tricia, do you have something?
I want to mention that, I guess, one takeaway.
Oh, we can't hear you, Trish.
Seriously? Is this better?
I can now.
Now we can hear you.
Okay. One takeaway for me would be just this very subtle idea, but very powerful, because language is that, just changing that word. We care for people regardless of differences, to we will be caring for people regardful of differences. I just think that is so powerful, that just that slight shift in language can really make a difference, and I'm going to be taking that up in my...
I think it's really helpful in an interview with a family is to be fully aware that the person that's the registered nurse is very different to the people that you're interviewing. Yeah, I think that's really helpful.
Yes.
In the United States, we do have some.
Just wait, Sandy. Go ahead, Julie.
Okay.
Oh, you want me to go ahead?
Yep, go ahead.
We do have some workforce diversity issues in that, high we're unable to recruit the diverse nurse to care in proportion to the amount of diversity we have in our population. How do you recruit your minority nurses?
They are still a minority, particularly in the South Island. There's less Māori. We're very widely populated in the South Island altogether. For example, our country is about the same size as the UK. They've got 80 million people in their country. We've got about 4.5 million. And Māori are more congregated in the North Island. For instance, if you were nursing in the north of the North Island, you would have a lot of Māori students in your classroom. And so I'm not sure how we engage Māori. I think it's all about a lot of things, and one of them is that we have a raupu, that is the senior Māori figures in the community, senior registered nurses that are Māori, and we go to them and consult with them about our degree and particularly our Māori health paper. So like non-Māori do not change the assessment without consultation, and that consultation, we go with their guidance. And I think a reputation of these processes helps Māori students feel that they'll be safe in our degree and that they can come into the degree. But I remember years ago, Ere Hapati answered a question that we had about the lack of Māori nursing students in the bachelor's degree at the time, and she said at the time, and it's probably the same now, that young Māori people were not necessarily choosing traditional careers anymore, like nursing or teaching. They were wanting to have even more influence, or if it's even more influence, and going into law and areas where they could have larger impact, or that they perceived as where they can have impact. And I think that goes along with our young people anyway, and that is that young women have a lot more choices, for example, for their careers now. So they don't necessarily go into traditional careers anymore. When I was young, it was nursing, secretarial work like banking and teaching. They were what I was faced with. So I chose between those careers. It's not like that now, is it?
No.
Does anybody else have any other questions or comments? Okay, well, I'm going to stop the recording, and that was great. And we'll get the link out to everybody so everybody can do it. Thank you, everyone.